Hello, I'm Shanti Sumartayo and this is
Lisa Grocott.
And in this video we're going to talk about design as an integrative practice and participatory prototyping. So Lisa, you've got this wonderful diagram here that helps us understand what you mean by design as an integrative practice. Can you explain what that is?
Sure. What this diagram is trying to capture is these different orientations to design. And what I think is interesting about design is I think it kind of operates in these sort of paradoxes. And so it has this very grounded, solution-seeking, get things done, make things right kind of way of thinking, and this very speculative, imagining the sort of social imaginary of these different futures. And within design, there's people that would position themselves way over here. If you're going to be designing trains or buses or whatever, you're going to be working a lot with engineers. If you're going to be, looking at futures of emergent technology, you might be sitting in this sort of space. And then there's also people that are very grounded in a sort of people-centered practice that could have far more parallels to like nursing or social work or something, right? Where it's really grounded in meeting people where they're at, making sense of what their kind of needs across a system are. And then there's the way that I was taught design, which was far more like sitting in a studio making stuff, and the conversation wasn't with other people out in the world, it was like me in conversation with the materials and seeing what kind of emerged that way. And so what I noticed in my work with other disciplines is this idea that depending what discipline I was kind of working with, right, whether they were a sort of STEM discipline or a humanities one, the place where we met was different. And it would often be like, we both think speculatively, we both think creatively, but I'm also going to be asking really hard questions about where will this end in an applied way that you might not be thinking about, or in a different collaboration that was totally the other way around, right, where we might agree on this, but I'd be saying, well, I'm going to be the one pushing you and asking us to sort of think more creatively. So it felt like a way into acknowledging both that design is integrative because it's sort of the push and pull of these practices, of these sort of orientations, is part of the tension that kind of, I think, makes it interesting, but it also is why I think design is a really interesting kind of collaborator in those sort of transdisciplinary spaces, because it's not wedded to one way of doing anything. Does that make sense?
So there's something about design that makes it particularly good at collaborating with different disciplines.
Yeah, Roger Martin is like a business innovation person, and he sort of has a book called The Opposable Mind, and his thing was about how integrative thinking, and he was very interested in design thinking, was about, the opposable mind was that quality, right? It's like when they say that the paradoxical thinking is the sort of ultimate type of thinking, to be able to hold two different opposing ideas, and I just think that's kind of in the heart of design practice, is that creative tension where you're kind of thinking of really pragmatic things like budgets and getting things done and how that kind of works in a very logistical way, at the same time as sort of imagining something that's never been imagined before, and it's sort of always negotiating and navigating those opposing positions.
I mean, one thing it seems to me that design is really good at, and is a place where it connects to, but also can be in tension with a practice like ethnography, is around futurity and sort of thinking forward. And on this diagram, you've got that represented through the kind of speculation and the solution-seeking aspects. But I wonder about this this idea of how design has this kind of forward-moving sort of energy.
It's so funny because I've always thought the futures parts, it's here.
Yeah.
Because to me, I just inevitably think of that speculative as, if you sort of understood that other disciplines were interested in making sense of how the world is, that design was framed in that, how the world could be, and what are the ways that you invite people or give people permission to sort of think or act otherwise. Sort of making things better argument, or making things right, or making good is, the tension of just who is better for whom, right? And, like, is that better for the person who, the client, the person paying for your work was often, the client that's bankrolling it, and it might be better for him to be done one way, but the people living with that so-called preferred solution might not be better for them. And,
But that process of looking to the future, of speculating, of kind of being solution-minded without trying to preclude what those solutions are. I mean, this speaks to the other thing we wanted to talk about today, which was about participatory prototyping. So could you start by explaining what that is?
So I might. So we've been just talking about this sort of axes in a way, whereas the participatory prototyping for me is that it kind of traverses from this, whether you call it co-design, participatory design, human-centered design, very much this idea that, who are you designing for and how we're engaging them, giving them voice in the process. And then, like I said, my design education, which was far more like that you would, start from a place of, designing something and just sort of the prototype would speak back to you, and then you would, ultimately put it out into the world in maybe like a user testing way. Designers, that people from this school would fall for so Henry Ford talked about, I would never ask people what they'd want because they'd say they want a faster horse. Steve Jobs sort of famously, would refuse focus groups because he was like, people don't know what they want. Like if I ask them, I can't get, it's sort of like I will put a prototype in front of them and then watch their kind of reaction to that. And so I think that there's a way to bring these two together, right? Which is, how do you be putting things into the world and then really in a kind of disciplined way attune to what their response is and kind of be paying attention to that. So it's not the starting with just asking people questions necessarily, which some of this work does, and not starting from a place of I'm going to make my beautiful object in isolation and then put it out into the world, but how these two things are in conversation with each other. So that's sort of how I make sense of participatory prototyping as the thing that traverses that way.
So Lisa, you've also been talking about the expanded field of making. We've got another diagram here. Could you take us through how design as an integrative practice relates to this notion of the expanded field of making? So I was totally the designer that always enjoyed the verb more than the artifact. And I always worked with people that liked the artifacts more, but I was always the person that enjoyed that sort of process. And so I think when I was doing this other one, which was far more about how to work and talk to other disciplines in terms of the orientation that a designer could bring, what I found interesting was I started thinking about, that one of those frames, one of the positions I had to keep taking was how not to be pigeonholed as the designer of the thing, right? In a collaboration, how not to be the designer of the disseminated report or the designer of the app. And that if I thought that I could completely help people reframe the hypothesis from the beginning, say, if I was working with people that thought through the frame of hypothesis testing, or if I could, help evolve that, in a sort of prototyping way, how if I could kind of be out in the world helping evolve what it was that we were designing so that we had better research questions. What was I doing in those spaces if it was not designing a thing? And I started to think of that in this expanded field of making, and that there were lots of things that were being made, right? It wasn't just this idea that we were making artifacts. And so here it talks about, making with, make known, make sense, make believe, all these sort of different types of making. But in doing this, almost every time I do this diagram, I'm privileging different things. This isn't sort of fixed, but it's more like how being able to name and understand that every move that we're sort of making as a designer does have these sort of different affordances and bringing some sort of intentionality to that. And so through the lens of the participatory prototyping one that we were talking about, making known is sort of making those unmet needs unknown, right? Or kind of surfacing kind of beliefs or people's mental models of the world, like the habits that they might have, or routines. So that feels to me very aligned with a lot of what ethnographic work would be seeking to do, right? Like kind of bringing that into the foreground. You talk about sort of that making explicit, right, as part of that. And then the make tangible feels more like the artifact side of things that we were talking about before, the sort of inquisitive ity prototyping piece. And so that's where I was coming from with this expanded field of making. Just a frame of design that feels more expansive. Now, and there's a really great example that you were going to talk us through about that starts with, I believe,
Yeah.
a
Yeah. So I
Trojan horse.
Can you take?
Yes. So take us through an example of participatory prototyping.
Yeah, so what I thought would be good is if so what this is a research project that, went on over, probably a year, 18 months. I had different collaborators along the way. And the project had started from a place of looking at, I was working with a lot of educators at the time, education researchers, and it was sort of around 21st century skills, soft skills, social emotional learning, whichever way you kind of look at that. And, there's endless sort of evidence about, that those skills are directly transferable to their kind of resilience, how they thrive, post-education experiences, right? And yet we sort of tend to value it as something that you do in kindergarten and prep, and then it sort of stops. Right. And so we were trying to think of, what would be the designerly way of sort of turning up to an interview, how would I bring my kind of expertise to that. And my collaborator on this project at this phase was Mai Kabori, and she made this beautiful, like really large origami horse. And we positioned this as a sort of Trojan horse and took into one-on-one interviews with people. And we saw it as a sort of discursive prop, right? And we called it a metaphor probe. And it was this idea that, we're taking this metaphor and saying, here's metaphorically a Trojan horse. And if we want to get social emotional learning 21st century skills into the curriculum, sort of sneak it into the curriculum, how would we do that? And kind of just put this horse on the table between us. And what was interesting for me in that, so what we were doing was we were sort of making tangible, we're putting this real or metaphoric thing in front of them in a way that allowed us to sort of make with, right? That now we were framing this as a sort of conversation. It wasn't me just trying to retrieve information from them. It was definitely like, how would you riff and run on these ideas? Gave me permission to talk with them. And what was really interesting, completely blew our mind the way people used the horse, right? So the metaphor was useful. So people sort of sat there and would say things like, who's at war with whom, and, that type of thing. But they also worked with the metaphor in the gift way of like, so if this is a gift to the community, the educational community, what is the outside gift that they say, yes, we want this, to then have the inside gift of those skills that we're talking about. So the metaphor obviously worked as a sort of creative prompt, but it was also the physicality, the artifact, that was really interesting. So sometimes it would just be people would be off on a riff and they'd kind of forgotten what they were talking about, and it became this, like, kind of anchor to the conversation, and they would sort of go, but the horse, let's come back to the horse. It sort of worked in that way. But also there were people that just held the horse, right, and just sort of felt the weight of the horse, people that turned the horse around as if the horse would really have answers. There were people that, almost like hugged the horse as if the horse was going to talk to them. Like, there were these really interesting ways that we could have had like a photo of a horse on the table or something, or we could have just said the metaphor, but there was definitely something about this tangible artifact that helped. And that, information that came from that, the sort of inquiry that came from that prop led to the next project. Everything in the system worked against valuing these things. So if you reframed that you get the educational behaviour that you reward, what if we completely reconceptualise the academic transcript, which at the moment is a sort of somewhat over time meaningless document that just has course units and grades, right? And then people, that's what they think they're there to study. It's all about their GPA. It becomes all about these things. So how would you have a learning transcript that actually embodied what the values of an institution were and what we claim a liberal arts education or humanities, or whatever that undergrad degree might be? But ultimately, it was sort of like, your idea won't work. It was sort of like that all the institutional, political, economic, all the cultural reasons that it would fail. And the designer in me was still thinking, okay, that, to go back to the previous diagram, it was sort of a little bit like, I'm throwing out something like a solution, and it's impossible, the speculative move hasn't even been made, right? Like, it's sort of like, how do you even begin to imagine something that was going to ask the professors, the lecturer, the tutors, etc., to be doing something they don't normally capture any kind of data or evidence on. And then I designed very quick, but it looked really resolved. You know, I sort of designed like a finished looking alternate transcript. I thought through some of their complaints really kind of practically, like, you know, what was something that would only take tutors 2 minutes at the end of a semester to be like, what were the students' strengths? So how did they advance the learning of others? You know, what was their kind of preparedness coming to class? There were things that, ways that the student could enter data of how they'd spent time on different types of mindfulness practice, elective, you know, all the sort of co-curricular things they might do. There was a video that you had to upload once a year on the thing that you'd done that year that was most learning from failure kind of moment. So that was documented over 4 years. You know, this is how you had sort of come to learn from those experiences. So some of them are ways of how to have a better transcript that you could go out into the world. Employers would look at it and be like, this is quite a meaningful way of me understanding what you've learned. There was a whole lot of peer review of each other, of, you know, did someone bring humility to a collaboration? Did they bring leadership skills? Were they playful? Were they creative? So it was all based on different types of research and then laid out in this new transcript. And then I met with the advisors again, and after sort of saying, no, this could never happen, they were like, oh, this could totally happen. And, you know, the move wasn't that I hadn't resolved half the things. It was still definitely, this was not a solution. It wasn't trying to be a prototype of a Stanford could do this. What I think I had done with that prop, right, of this sort of, is that you were just putting out into the world, you had kind of just lifted enough of what their imagination of that could be, right? Like, so in a social imaginary way, now there was a thing that wasn't the thing, so they didn't have to get caught in the weeds of, well, this couldn't work and this couldn't work. There was just enough of a kind of promise of its potential that allowed them to sort of see a way forward and imagine, you know, how an institution might use something like this. And so for me, that was the, you know, the sort of making possible to make believe, you know, kind of argument. And then the other piece was, so you've sort of got to a place of make believe, but if we were trying to get to a place of imagining better transcripts, not necessarily me designing an ultimate transcript, that's like a, you know, years long conversation for people to be having, which people are doing. But how do you sort of take from the seeds of those first props, you know, in a participatory prototyping way to another level? And my collaborator at Stanford was a woman called Helen Chen, and she was like a keynote at a conference a few weeks later, and she just happened to have the betwixt, is what it's called, this betwixt transcript. It was what you were learning betwixt the courses you were doing. She just happened to have it on an iPad, and this wasn't an intentional affordance we had thought of, but it just became, in a way, one of the most powerful things about that betwixt transcript was that, you know, in 3 minutes she could step people through this transcript. They could kind of look at it, it would kind of light their imagination, they could feel excited, they could see what that might be. There was a sort of information design page that sort of basically was a 10-second critique of how we currently map versus what we could be mapping, and she just sort of described that it felt like you were giving people this very real gift, but the gift was the potential of something, versus saying what you would normally do is, here's my business card, write to me, I can send you some papers. You know, and that's a very different type of exchange, right? You know, that they might write to her, but then they're also sent 3 papers they have to read, and this was sort of like just the spark of something. So I feel like she was doing it in a putting this prototype now out into the world of imagination, right, and motivating people. And then what I did was take it into the classroom and start thinking, so every at the end of my students' assignments, we had these very different types of assessment exercises. So there was sort of ways where students had to say about each other, you know, very different sort of peer prompts. So they would be things like, you know, what was the superpower this person had in a collaboration? And the person that, by their own admission, had felt like they were really struggling in a collaboration and did feel like they weren't contributing as much, you know, was, everyone would say she always knew when to bring orange juice to everyone. She always knew how to take care of the people when we were doing co-design workshops. She really knew how to show up. And that tiny insight became this really meaningful way for the student to reframe and understand what they did, and really channeled, you know, where they went in their career after that. But there was sort of just lots of different, we did visualizations about the kind of learning pit of where people failed and where what they had to do to climb out of it during the semester. And so we sort of started to have these, you know, ways that we, in the classroom, were sort of playing out in granular detail some of the affordances that had been shone a light on from the transcript. So that to me felt like now we were doing the really, kind of making sense of things so we could work out how to make it better. And then that, ultimately we were getting to this place of how do we use these sort of incremental moves to make better decisions around how we would change transcripts. So even wasn't the work we did, you can kind of see that those examples traversed across this whole.
So Lisa, you have this framework for thinking about participatory prototyping as you've just explained it. Could you talk us through that?
Yeah, so I think what this did for me, right, was expose, in a way, the moves that are being made. Whereas I think design uses the word prototyping often as a sort of catch-all for what is really like this, very experiential, iterative, tentative, evaluative practice. And oftentimes, with the examples I just gave, they're not like prototypes of the final thing, like the Trojan horse and the betwixt weren't that. And so I started thinking of, if you sort of broke down participatory prototyping, it's like a tongue twister, to those different phases, that if you think that what was happening in the beginning with the Trojan horse, those were like sort of putting, in a way, prompts or probes or props, now I'm just adding more P's, out into the world. So those probes and props become ways of that, making tangible to make with people. Then I think that the next phase to me was almost like a proof of concept. So it's not trying to be the thing. Like if in scientific terms, a proof of concept experiment is we're going to do the small to see whether it's worth doing large. Whereas I feel like the imaginary version of that, right, is a bit more like this make believe, make possible, putting this proof of concept transcript out there wasn't trying to be to prove anything, but it's sort of like the proof of the potential, I guess, is the thing that you're sort of inspiring and running with. And then the last one is this playtesting and prototyping, which is far more like, now you're actually kind of in the wild with it, right? Like, those other ones were in quite controlled environments of design workshops and different things, but now we're testing it with students, Helen is like showing it to strangers in conferences. It's like now you are sort of play testing with people what this could be, piloting, prototyping, the actual iterations of the thing to get to the part that would be the ultimate kind of change. So I suppose I think that framework of the probes, the prompts, the proof of concept, the playtesting, prototyping, those three phases seem all like just stages toward, what I would see as to bring it back to ethnography, it seems like the way you might talk about attunement is there's this kind of, if you were talking about attuning to the materials or the conversation, design talks about being in conversation with materials of the situation. And in this case, we're sort of saying to be in conversation with the people of the situation as well, right? And it feels like that, to me, I always talk about that sort of discipline of noticing, right? That there's something about looking through all those evaluative phases, because they're evaluative and generative at the same time is what's interesting in design, right? You're never just evaluating a thing. You're like, it's always the next phase is still going to be that sort of convergent, divergent thinking thing. So it feels like that's how it kind of wraps up, is this discipline of noticing, so you can kind of look at the valences of what happens when these prototypes are bumping up against people, so that you can ultimately really make preferred futures that work for lots of people and not just
the few. Which is a great place to end this video. Thank you so much for that chat. That was absolutely fascinating.
It was really enjoyable for me too to think through.
Great. And thanks for watching our video on design as an integrative practice and participatory prototyping.